Hello and welcome to the Turkish History Podcast. Episode 64. Myriokephalon. Before we begin, if you have been enjoying this podcast, I'd like to ask you to please subscribe, rate, and leave a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get this podcast. It would mean a lot to me and would help more people find the podcast. Thank you for listening. So last time, we discussed the final spasms of the anti-Kılıç Arslan alliance. How the Sultan had survived the attempts of Nureddin and his allies to defeat him, but how in the process, Kılıç Arslan had suffered defeats on the battlefield and a loss of caliphal recognition. We ended with the death of Nureddin Zengi and Kılıç Arslan's subsequent victory, the collapse of his enemies, and his virtually bloodless conquest of Anatolia. But we also ended with the Roman emperor sitting nervously in Constantinople, watching the rise of the limping lion with growing trepidation. And today, we will see the culmination of all of this. The death of the light of the faith, the rise of Kılıç Arslan to supremacy in Anatolia, and the fear and indeed ambition of Manuel Komnenos. All of this will come together to lead to a great battle between the Emperor of the Romans and the Roman Sultan. One of the greatest and most important battles to ever take place on the blood-soaked soil of Anatolia. One of the worst defeats ever suffered by the Roman Empire, and one of the greatest victories in all of Turkish history. A victory to rival Manzikert itself. Myriokephalon. Now to begin, let's step back and look at where the two sides were in 1175. As we discussed last time, Kılıç Arslan now stood triumphant in Anatolia. The death of Nureddin had led to the immediate collapse of the alliance of smaller Anatolian beys opposed to Konya. In a campaign of just over a couple months, Kılıç Arslan had finished off the Danişmend Beylik once and for all, and now stood as the unquestioned master of Turkish Anatolia. Indeed, campaign doesn't even seem to be the right word for what happened. This was more like a bloodless victory lap. The Sultan just riding around Anatolia and accepting the submission of various cities as his former enemies fled, mostly to Constantinople. So by 1175, the limping lion was sitting pretty in Konya, happily surveying his new conquests, rejoicing that his enemies were all either dead or gone, and reveling in being the master of Turkish Anatolia. And as we discussed last time, this greatly disquieted Manuel Komnenos. The emperor further miscalculated that the death of Nureddin Zengi had deprived the Sultan of a great ally, not, as was the reality, ridded him of his greatest rival. Thus, with the imperial position in western Anatolia stronger than it had been in decades, and with the dreams of driving the Turks out of Anatolia once and for all again filling his head, the audacious, hyperactive, occasionally delusional, gambler emperor set out to reverse the verdict of Manzikert. This effort began in 1175 with a series of campaigns in northwestern Anatolia and in Pontus, that is the land along the Black Sea. First, Manuel intended to strengthen the empire's position in the pocket of the Anatolian plateau most closely bordering Iznik and Constantinople itself. The plains around Eskişehir, that is, the famous plains of Dorylaeum. This was the very edge of the Sultanate, the porous frontier zone where the influence of Constantinople and Konya overlapped. Likely, many of the cities and towns would have owed allegiance to the empire, or else oscillated between the empire and the Sultanate, with the locals almost certainly just wanting to be left alone. However, Niketas Choniates does confirm that much of the grasslands here were under the Sultanate's control, and that they were particularly valuable to the Turks, writing, "The Turks knew that they would be in danger should they be forced to abandon the fertile plains of Dorylaeum, on which their herds of goats and cattle grazed, romping in the verdant meadows." Manuel's plan was to cement Roman control in this corner of the plateau by reinforcing the city of Dorylaeum itself, both through physically rebuilding the city and its defenses and installing a large Roman garrison. Indeed, it seems from Choniates and John Kinemos that the city of Dorylaeum itself had declined substantially after Manzikert from Turkish attack and the Crusader invasion, with John Kinemos going so far as to say, "The Turks, when their assault against the Romans reached its peak, threw down the city to its foundations, and rendered it entirely bereft of inhabitants. Everything there vanished, even to the barest trace of its former splendor. Such was this city." Rebuilding and reinforcing Dorylaeum would give the empire a toehold on the plateau itself, and potentially provide a staging point for armies to march against Konya. Dorylaeum, after all, had centuries earlier been the traditional staging point for Roman armies marching across the plateau. Thus, in spring 1175, the emperor himself gathered up an imperial army in Constantinople and marched it to Iznik, up through the mountains, onto the Anatolian plateau, and into what remained of Dorylaeum. Choniates tells us that Manuel Komnenos drove off a tribe of about 2,000 nomadic Turkmen, who typically camped on the grasslands around what remained of the city. The emperor immediately set his men to work repairing the walls and constructing a barracks. As Dorylaeum became full of the sounds of hammers, saws, and pickaxes, word of the imperial advance made its way to Konya. Kılıç Arslan was naturally alarmed, but he seems to have not wanted an actual war or serious confrontation with the emperor. Remember, he was basically still in the process of wrapping up his conquest of Anatolia. These new territories still had to be digested. And from his perspective, the relationship with the empire was going well enough, as long as the emperor didn't try to do something stupid, like enforce the terms of the treaty that Kılıç Arslan had been forced to agree to in Constantinople during his days of weakness. And thus, the limping lion sent off an embassy to Dorylaeum instead of an army. But the emperor was in no real mood to talk. Indeed, Choniates says, "With curling lips, Manuel perused the contents of the Sultan's letters." And it was now that the emptiest of all of Kılıç Arslan's empty promises, made during his days of weakness in Constantinople, reared its head. The emperor demanded that the Sultan deliver to him the cities of northern and eastern Anatolia that the limping lion had promised to return to Constantinople after their fall, namely Amasya and Sivas. But like I said, there was obviously no way that Kılıç Arslan was ever going to agree to do that. And so reluctantly, the Sultan began to prepare for war. The first flashpoint would be Amasya. Originally founded by Mithridates I in the chaos following the death of Alexander the Great, the ancient city served as the first capital of the ancient kingdom of Pontus, and still houses the cave tombs of the Mithridatic kings. It eventually became one of the most important cities of Roman Anatolia, and eventually one of the capitals of the Danishmend Beylik. Amasya was therefore one of the ancient cities of Anatolia that Kılıç Arslan had, in his days of weakness, promised to return to the empire, and which, of course, he had no intention of ever giving up. Now, therefore, Manuel dispatched 2 armies to seize it for the empire. The first army was to be led by a man named Michael Gavras, and was to depart from Pontus, march south over the Pontic Alps and into Amasya. The choice of Michael Gavras was actually very savvy. If you will recall, the Gavras family had long ruled in Pontus, at times even in defiance of Constantinople. This was a family with deep roots in the region, a family that could assemble and command a Pontic army and then hold Amasya. And remember that even at this very moment, Kılıç Arslan's Grand Vizier, Ihtiyar al-Din ibn Hassan Gavras, was himself a member of the Gavras clan, the son of a Gavras who had converted to Islam and who now served the Roman Sultan. The second army was to be led by none other than Shahan Shah, the half-brother of the Limping Lion himself. Shahan Shah had of course fled to Constantinople, and the emperor had brought him east in the imperial baggage train as he departed for Dorylaeum. Again, this was a savvy pick. Shahan Shah had ruled in Ankara, in north-central Anatolia, and had been married to a Danishmend princess. He would have had experience and legitimacy among the Turks of northern Anatolia, the environs of Ankara, Çankırı, and Amasya. This army under Shahan Shah, likely composed of Turkish and Roman troops, was to depart east from Dorylaeum, ride across the plateau itself, and link up with Gavras to secure imperial control over Amasya. All in all, not a bad plan. Gavras and his army departed from the Black Sea coast and marched south, through the towering peaks of the Pontic Alps and onto the Anatolian plateau. News, of course, soon reached Kılıç Arslan II, and the Limping Lion must have decided that this army presented a more immediate concern than that of the emperor in Dorylaeum. The Sultan thus gathered up his army and began racing north towards Amasya. However, Michael Gavras and his Byzantine army made it to the city first, and were invited in. This is not too surprising. Remember, the city would have been overwhelmingly Greek, Armenian, and Kartvelian at the time, though Amasya had famously preferred the Turks to the emperor in the immediate post-Manzikert period. All in all, though, I think we should remember that the local population's overriding concern was almost certainly to avoid destruction, so they were likely to agree with the guys with the swords and the bows, whoever they were. Gavras told the population, "I know the Sultan is on the way, but don't worry, we've got our own Turkish army on the way as well, this one led by Shahan Shah, the former Bey of Ankara." So the imperial plan seemed to be working right up to this point, because the second prong of the imperial attack, the attack of Shahan Shah, would prove to be a disaster. Indeed, Shahan Shah barely made it out of Dorylaeum. John Kinnamos tells us, "But it, Shahanshah's army, had not gone far when a force of Turks, which was lying in wait, killed many of the Romans with him and sated themselves on sufficient spoil. Escaping with difficulty, Shahanshah returned to the emperor in terror. Thus the man's affairs always ended in ill fortune. So Shahanshah's army just was not going to make it to aid Gavras in Amasya. Meanwhile, the limping lion arrived at Amasya with his army, an army likely many times the size of the expeditionary force commanded by Gavras. And when the news of Shahanshah's defeat got to the city, it was clear that the reinforcements Michael Gavras had assured the locals were on the way were just not going to come. This caused the locals, unsurprisingly, to immediately switch sides. Michael Gavras and his expeditionary force were ejected from the city, and he fled back to the coast, as Amasya was returned to the Roman Sultan. Gavras would soon be back in Constantinople, where the furious emperor would basically try him for treason and throw him in prison. An extremely unfair accusation and punishment, I think, especially as he was later released when the emperor calmed down. The first imperial attempt to enforce the terms of the Treaty of 1162 thus ended ignominiously. But Manuel Komnenos was, of course, not going to accept this as the final verdict. Yes, he was absolutely furious that the attempt to enforce his claim over Amasya and the eastern cities had failed. But this did nothing but increase his resolve. And so the rebuilding at Dorylaeum continued apace, and the emperor was soon ordering the reconstruction of Sublaeum, now called Keçiborlu, and ordering enforcements sent to Rindakos on Ulubatı Göl near modern-day Bursa. With the Byzantine position in western Anatolia thus strengthened and his toehold on the plateau established, Manuel Komnenos returned to Constantinople for the winter of 1175 to 1176, and he began putting together a great army to launch a massive assault on the Sultanate in the spring, an army with the goal of taking the very capital of the Sultanate of Rum and succeeding where the emperor himself had failed in the first years of his reign. Manuel Komnenos was planning on capturing Konya itself. Meanwhile, Kılıç Arslan II was, for his part, not eager for war. Over the winter of 1175-1176, he yet again attempted to come to a deal with the emperor. In a funny little turn of events, the limping lion sent off his grand vizier, Ikhtiar al-Din ibn Hassan Gavras, to the Queen of Cities. Manuel had sent one member of the Gavras clan to take Amasya. Kılıç Arslan sent another to negotiate with the emperor. One wonders if the two cousins had a chance to meet in the city after Michael Gavras's release from prison. I picture Michael laughing at Ikhtiar al-Din's Persian-style robes, and Ikhtiar al-Din inquiring after members of the family still living in the empire. Ikhtiar al-Din ibn Hassan Gavras would have been a perfect ambassador. Naturally, he was a native Greek speaker and a member of a great and noble house, in addition to being the Grand Vizier. However, the emperor was, of course, just not willing to talk. Gavras's pleas to renew or renegotiate the peace fell on deaf ears, and he departed for Konya sometime in early 1176. He would meet the emperor next at Myriokephalon. And I would just note again how the existence of people like Ikhtiar al-Din ibn Hassan Gavras demonstrate the fluid nature of Anatolia at this time. A Seljuk Grand Vizier who was a member of a Greek noble family and whose own father had likely been a convert to Islam. And he was not the only such figure. Indeed, Kinemos makes an offhand reference to a certain Michael who served as an attendant to Manuel Komnenos at this very time, claiming that Michael was a barbarian by birth. Indeed, his name was previously Ishaq. That is, a man who made the opposite journey from Ikhtiar al-Din's family, a Turk who had turned Greek, rather than Greeks who had turned Turk. And this is extremely important to remember. As much as we speak of war between Greeks and Turks, indeed this whole episode is about one of the greatest of those wars. The relationship between the two peoples is far more than that, and reality was far more complicated and indeed more interesting. With Ikhtiar al-Din Gavras's mission to Constantinople a failure, war was inevitable when spring came. And thus, as the snows began to melt, the Roman Empire and the Sultanate of Rum stepped over the precipice, and one of the most important military campaigns to ever take place in the history of Anatolia began. A war that would, it turns out, settle the future of Anatolia itself in many ways. The imperial campaign to reconquer Anatolia was to be two-pronged. In the north, an army under the command of Andronikos Vatatzes was to march south from the Pontic coast to take the citadel town of Niksar, in nearby Amasya. Niksar, if you will recall, was the citadel where Gümüştegin Gazi had imprisoned the crusader Lord Bohemund decades earlier. The emperor, it seems, was still determined to wrest the ancient eastern cities from the Sultanate. Andronikos Vatatzes was a nephew of Emperor Manuel Komnenos and a member of a great and noble Byzantine house of Greek origin. And though I think that this is the first time that a Vatatzes has shown up on the show, as we go forward, they will pop up with increasing frequency. However, yet again, the attempt to take Amasya fell apart basically immediately. See, yet again, the emperor was relying on a combination of Byzantine and Turkish forces in his invasion of the region. This time, Turkish forces led by Melik Zunun. When Melik Zunun brought his army to Niksar to join Andronikos Vatatzes in putting the city to siege, the local townspeople were apparently able to sow discord between the two commanders. Melik Zunun and Andronikos Vatatzes were provoked into turning on each other, and Vatatzes ultimately lost his life in the subsequent battle. His corpse was then decapitated, and his head was sent off to the Sultan of Rum. Thus, the second attempt by the emperor to take Kılıç Arslan's newly acquired territories in the east ended again in disaster. But the main army was not the army sent off to northern Anatolia with Vatatzes. It was instead to march with the emperor in the campaign to take Konya. Manuel Komnenos assembled a truly massive army, at least massive by the standards of the now reduced empire. Modern historians estimate that the army likely stood around 35,000 strong. It included not only the Byzantine Tagmata heavy cavalry, but also divisions of Byzantine heavy infantry and Latin knights from the west. This was further supplemented by contingents of Hungarian cavalry and Serbian infantry sent from the emperor's ally Bela, the king of Hungary, and a crusader contingent sent from Antioch, now an imperial vassal, and led by none other than Baldwin, the Prince of Antioch himself. This army assembled at Lopadian, near Ulubatı Göl, outside of modern-day Bursa. However, As troops were coming from across the empire, from the Balkans and from the Levant, there were naturally delays. The usually hyperactive and audacious emperor was forced to anxiously kick his heels and pace around Lopadion as spring began to turn to summer, waiting for the Hungarians, the Serbs, and the Latins to arrive. Finally, likely sometime in late May, Manuel Komnenos was finally able to depart after months of delay, a delay that would prove to be costly. Reportedly, the army was so massive that it spread over 10 miles from end to end as it marched. And so, Emperor Manuel Komnenos began marching into Anatolia. In the words of Niketas Choniates, numbering his troops in the tens of thousands, he marched out, intent on destroying the Turkish nation, and on taking by storm Iconium and her walls, and on holding captive the Sultan, whose neck he would trample as a footstool when he prostrated himself. The emperor's original plan appears to have been to march onto the plateau and then move quickly from his new forward base at Dorylaeum to strike at Konya, essentially marching along the route that the First Crusade had taken across the plateau. However, the delay of the campaign seems to have made this impossible. Manuel Komnenos loved the lightning strike for a reason. An enemy forewarned is an enemy forearmed. But while the Byzantines had been waiting in Lopadion for the full army to assemble, Kılıç Arslan had been forewarned. It seems that the plateau was now bristling with Turkish warriors. Indeed, Niketas Choniates tells us that upon hearing the news of the massing of the Roman armies, the Roman Sultan began summoning all the might of Turkish Anatolia, writing, "Because of these events, the Sultan gave heed to war and drew upon substantial numbers of allied troops from Mesopotamia and from among the barbarians of the same race from the north." And here we see the consequences of Manuel's first great blunder. He had believed that the death of Nureddin Zengi made the limping lion weaker, when in reality it made him the master of Turkish Anatolia and gave him a virtually unlimited pool of Turkish horse archers to draw from. With this great Turkish army still assembling, the second sword lion then copied the tactic of his namesake, the first Kılıç Arslan. The Sultan ordered the land despoiled in front of the Crusader advance. The fields burned, the animals hunted or driven out of the region, and the wells clogged and despoiled with feces and corpses. And by the time the Imperial Army was ready to march, of course, it was summer, so the Anatolian plateau was now a baking furnace. Without water, there was just no way that an army 35,000 strong and their thousands of horses and pack animals could make it across the plateau in fighting shape, especially as, no doubt, bands of Turks would soon appear from over the horizon the second they entered the plateau. Therefore, the emperor abandoned his plan for the march across the plateau from Dorylaeum straight for Konya. Instead, he opted for the southern route, the route that he had used to reach Konya decades earlier, when he was a much younger man. The emperor took the great imperial army and marched it south, through the interior of western Anatolia to the Meander Valley. The Meander Valley is the single best route from the Aegean coast to the center of the Anatolian plateau. It is a broad valley, shaped like an arrowhead, that juts through the mountains deep into the heart of Anatolia. This allows men and horses to move deep into Anatolia along flat and fertile land, along the banks of the winding river Meander. Indeed, our word meander in English comes from the name of this twisting river. And at the eastern end of the valley, the point of the arrowhead, if you will, there are comparatively easy passes up through the mountains and onto the plateau. The value of this route onto the plateau has been recognized for millennia, and virtually every state that has ruled Anatolia has run great highways up through the valley. The first highways were laid down by the Hittite Empire over 3,000 years ago. These were then followed by those made by the kings of Lydia, the Persian emperors, the Seleucid emperors, the kings of Pergamum, and the Romans. In the future, the Ottomans will build their own roads here, and in time, the Turkish Republic will build the current E87 highway through the valley. As the emperor entered the valley and began marching east, Kılıç Arslan of course ordered small groups of Turkish warriors off to harry the Roman army and slow its advance, and to despoil the land and the wells in front of their march. And he ordered the bulk of his armies, assembled from across Anatolia, to muster near Konya. But he also dashed off messengers. As always, the limping lion was eager to negotiate, and was hoping that he could yet again come to some sort of deal with the emperor. Honestly, for the man who was about to become the commander of the Turkish armies at one of the greatest victories in Turkish history, the limping lion's career does make him seem like a man who preferred negotiation to fighting. As the Sultan assembled the armies of Turkish Anatolia and sent off his ambassadors, Manuel and the Romans had marched out of the Meander Valley and had ascended into the mountains at its head. From here, the army continued to march east, making for the great upland lakes lying just to the west of Konya itself, Beyşehir Gölü and Eridir Gölü. The emperor's plan was to march through the passes to the north of Eridir Gölü before taking the great Roman highway towards Afyon, Akşehir, and then on to Konya itself. This march would take the army through the high mountains that rise up and protect the flat land of the plateau itself, and thus naturally through steep passes and defiles. This land, a land of stunning natural beauty by the way, was now in the porous frontier zone that lay between the Sultanate and the Roman Empire. It was therefore dotted with towns that oscillated in their loyalty between Konya and Constantinople, roving bands of Turkish tribesmen, and abandoned fortresses, first constructed centuries earlier when this was the heartland of the Roman Empire, but now left vacant except for the odd imperial scouting party or a Turkish band that might be marching by. And one of these abandoned Roman fortresses bore the name Myriokephalon, meaning, in Greek, the many heads. Now we don't know exactly where Myriokephalon was, except that it was almost certainly somewhere in the mountains just to the northwest of the great lake of Eridir Gölü. Most scholars today believe that it was somewhere in the vicinity of a small town now named Tzivitzre. It was a fortress that controlled one end of a key pass through the mountains, a pass called Tzivitzre in the Byzantine sources. Niketas Choniates says of the pass, "This place is a far-stretching defile, with mountain passes that descend gently the steep northern slope to the hills below, opening up into broad ravines and then dropping down on the other side to jutting rocks and precipitous, beetling cliffs." And it was at the abandoned fortress of Myriokephalon, the many heads, that the imperial army halted and set up camp in mid-September 1176, and that the Emperor of the Romans received the ambassadors of the Roman Sultan. As during his first march to Konya decades earlier, Emperor Manuel's advisors pleaded with him to accept the Sultan's offer to negotiate. The army had been harassed by Turkish hit-and-run attacks, of course, but it seems that the Second Sword Lion's scorched earth tactics had really done a number on the Romans. Niketas Choniates says that the army was hungry and thirsty, that every well they had come to was despoiled, and that dysentery was spreading among the troops. Furthermore, the senior commanders of Manuel's army did not share the emperor's delusional audacity, his gambler's streak. They knew that taking an army to Konya was almost certainly just not going to work. Therefore, they counseled the emperor to make a deal. As Choniates tells us, all those who were experienced in warfare, especially in Turkish combat, and who were advanced in age, entreated Manuel to receive the embassy with open arms, rather than to place all hopes on the die of battle. They begged him to keep in view how prodigious the contest would be, that the terrain was not easily passable, but beset with ambuscades, and that he should neither overlook the excellent Turkish horse at peak strength, nor ignore the sickness that afflicted the army. But Manuel Komnenos was just not going to hear of it. The emperor was determined to march on to Konya. He therefore haughtily dismissed the Turkish ambassadors, telling them that the matter would be decided in Konya. Empty-handed, the Turkish embassy left Myriokephalon and returned to the Limping Lion. But they didn't actually have to go that far, of course, because naturally, the Limping Lion was just now, at this very moment, on the other end of the steep and narrow pass, once guarded by the abandoned fortress of Myriokephalon. However, eager to come to some sort of deal, the Roman Sultan again sent his ambassadors back to the emperor with new terms. But now, he also began to fortify the pass. As Niketas Choniates tells us, the Sultan continued to pursue discussions over peace terms, but when he perceived that no progress was being made on the treaties, and that the emperor was boasting that he would give him his answer at Iconium, he occupied the rough ground called the defiles of Tzivitzre. And so it was that as the Roman army gathered in Myriokephalon, Kılıç Arslan prepared the Tzivitzre pass for their destruction. Ambushes were set up in the steep hills along the pass. A great army was set on the Turkish side, the side that the Romans would ultimately have to get to, and detachments were prepared to race forward along secret and circuitous routes towards the rear side of the pass to encircle the Roman army and bottle them up in the pass itself. These had long been the tactics Turkish armies had used when ambushing armies in mountain passes. Indeed, the coming battle brings to mind nothing so much as the Battle of the Defile, centuries earlier, when Suluk Khan annihilated the forces of the Umayyad Caliphate, led by Al-Junayd, in the mountains near Samarkand, thousands of miles away. And it turns out that Emperor Manuel Komnenos was completely unprepared for this. Likely, he did not appreciate the size of the armies that the Roman Sultan had raised. But regardless, I think it was his own personality, his stubbornness, his gambler's streak, his audacity bordering on delusion that was to blame. Other cooler heads were counseling him to act otherwise, but he ignored them and marched forward to one of the greatest defeats in the long history of the Roman Empire. And so it was that on September 17th, 1176, the Emperor of the Romans, Manuel Komnenos, marched his army out of Myriokephalon and into the Tzivitzre Pass. Niketas Choniates, normally a somewhat qualified admirer of Emperor Manuel Komnenos, is utterly scathing of the emperor's preparations, writing that he took no precautions on behalf of the army when he set out on such a path. He neither lightened the loads of the pack animals, nor did he put aside the wagons carrying the siege engines. The army was not placed into parataxis formations, but instead led into the pass in columns, completely spread out. The vanguard of the Roman army was led by two members of the family that will inherit the purple after the coming fall of the Komnenoi, the Angeloi, along with two other Byzantine nobles. Following the vanguard was the main army. The emperor naturally led the center, while the right wing was led by Baldwin, the Prince of Antioch, Manuel's crusader vassal, and the left wing was led by another Byzantine nobleman whose name I won't bother you with. Following this bulk of the main army was the baggage train. Again, a massive error was made in not placing the army into parataxis formations to protect the baggage. Following the baggage was the rearguard, led by Andronikos Kontostephanos, a nobleman of a family we've of course seen before. As the Roman army entered into the narrow pass, the Sultan ordered his men out. However, the plan was not to attack the Byzantines at the mouth of the pass, of course. In the classic Turkish tactic, Kılıç Arslan set a small group of soldiers at the entrance of the pass, who fired off some arrows, harassed the army a little bit, and then ran away down the pass as soon as the Romans attacked them. Meanwhile, Turks hid out in the hills and the outcroppings, behind the scant vegetation, and in the ravines and caves of the pass, and watched as the Roman army passed them by. Finally, when the Byzantine vanguard had nearly made it through the pass, and the whole Roman army was spread out in the pass itself, the second sword lion ordered the assault. Suddenly, Turks began pouring down from the steep hills of the pass, firing arrows and yelling their war cries. Simultaneously, the limping lion himself charged forward with the bulk of the army from the east end of the pass, slamming into the Byzantine vanguard. The Roman army, extended along the whole length of the pass and spread out in indefensible columns, suddenly found itself assaulted from all sides. In such a formation, the Romans were in no place to resist, and the army began breaking down along its flanks as Turks stormed down from the hills. The right wing of the Roman army, led by the Crusader lord, Baldwin of Antioch, collapsed entirely. The Turks utterly overwhelmed the Crusaders and the Byzantine troops as the right wing broke apart into small groups of men cut down by Turkish arrows and swords. With his men falling under Turkish arrows, the Prince of Antioch decided to at least go out fighting, and quite bravely gathered together his companions and bodyguards and rode forth to his doom. Niketas Choniates mournfully relates, "Thereupon Baldwin, seeing that his troops were in a sorry plight, too weak to break through the enemy's ranks and escape, and pressed hard on all sides, gathered certain of his knights, and rode through the Turkish phalanxes, but, surrounded by the enemy, he was slain. All of his companions fell with him, displaying desperate courage in their daring and noble deeds." Meanwhile, as the right wing of the Byzantine army fell apart, the troops that Kılıç Arslan had sent around the pass, along the winding routes through the hills, had made it to the west entrance through which the Romans had come. Thus assembled, They now barreled forward, attacking the Roman rear guard. The Romans were now facing an assault led by the Sultan of Rum on the east end of the pass, the Turks pouring down the hills on the sides, and a Turkish army attacking from the rear, bottling them up in Tzivitzre Pass. Manuel Komnenos and his great Byzantine army were now trapped. Tzivitzre now became an abattoir, a place of mass butchery, as the Turks fell upon the collapsing Roman army. The limping lion ordered his men forward to press the assault from all sides. Man and beast alike fell under withering Turkish arrow fire, and charges of sword and spear-wielding Turkish warriors now cut down their enemies by hand so as to not waste arrows. Niketas Choniates writes, "The ox was felled by a Turkish arrow, and the driver expired by its side. The horse and its rider were cast down together. The hollows were filled with bodies. The groves were glutted with the fallen. The babbling, rushing streams flowed red with blood. Blood commingled with blood, human blood, and the blood of pack animals. The horrors that took place there defy all description, since they could neither advance nor retreat, for the Turks took up positions in the rear and made the way forward impassable. The Romans, like cattle in their pens, were cut down in this gorge." And then a truly horrific sight broke whatever morale the Roman army still had. The Sultan of Rum ordered that a man ride forth carrying a long spear upon which was impaled the head of Manuel Komnenos' nephew, Andronikos Vatatzes, the man who had died in the failed attempt to take Niksar. Upon seeing the head, the horrified emperor realized the dire straits his army was in. The assault on Niksar had failed, and his nephew was dead. Surely that northern army had been destroyed, and here he and his army were, surrounded by Turks as the bloody massacre commenced. His great gamble had led to total disaster. Shaken, the emperor tried to save himself and at least a portion of his army. Part of the vanguard had managed to secure a small hill in the pass, where they set about making rudimentary defenses. Gathering together what forces around him he could, Manuel Komnenos pushed through the chaos of the battle and made for this small hill. The imperial party suffered grievous losses as they tried to push through the swarms of Turkish warriors and dying Romans, but after a great charge, they finally managed to break through and make it to the relative safety of the encampment. Niketas Choniates tells us, "Manuel slipped out of the phalanx's iron grip as though it were a trap set for a weasel. He suffered many wounds and bruises from sword and mace wielded by the Turks. His whole body was covered with injuries. His shield was pierced by some 30 bloodthirsty arrows, and he was unable to set straight his helmet, which had been knocked askew." As Manuel Komnenos recuperated, what remained of the Roman army outside of this small encampment totally collapsed. The right wing was entirely annihilated, with the left wing faring not much better. The lines of the bulk of the army in the center completely fell apart, as bands of Turks rode through the broken Byzantine army everywhere. Order within the Roman army totally collapsed, as every soldier attempted to flee to save himself. As small bands or individual soldiers broke away, they were chased down and slaughtered by pursuing Turks. And Choniates tells us that even those who managed to escape the carnage through the valley or up one of its arms ended up no better, for nor was the remaining area lacking in enemy, for the whole region was filled with them. But then something strange happened. Out of nowhere, a great wind arose. This wind whipped up the dust of the battlefield, dust kicked up by horses and men struggling across the pass. This dust storm then engulfed the battlefield. This proved to be both a curse and a boon to the Turks. First of all, Choniates tells us that both Romans and Turks became confused in the dust storm, with both sides ending up attacking their comrades by accident. But it also led the Turks, who had the upper hand and the numerical advantage, to assault the Romans unseen and disappear back into the dust and the wind. Honestly, imagining what it must have been like to be there brings to mind a horror film to me. Dust, blood, and gore everywhere, with enemies appearing out of the gloom, the roar of an unseen battle surrounding you on all sides as you hear men and animals die without seeing them. When the dust storm quieted and the fog of war dissipated to reveal the battlefield, the return of sight revealed that the Roman army had been almost entirely destroyed. Choniates laments, the greater part of the Romans fell, as did most of the emperor's most illustrious kinsmen. When the dust had settled and the blinding mist had dissipated, some were to be seen, alas how pitiful the spectacle, buried to the waist and neck in corpses. At this point, with his army in ruins and many of his noblemen and relatives dead, the emperor decided to make a run for it. He gathered up the men remaining in the encampment and tried to flee back out of the pass the way they had come. This party traversed back, crossing streams flowing with water and blood, and ground covered by corpses. But soon enough, of course, the Turks spied the retreat of the emperor. A band of Turks assembled and raced after Manuel Komnenos, hunting the emperor of the Romans. Many Byzantine nobles died in this pursuit, and reportedly, the Turks got so close to the emperor that while he was resting under a pear tree, a Turkish soldier even managed to rush forward and seize the reins of the emperor's horse to lead him away, but Manuel managed to fight him off. Finally, the emperor managed to find a somewhat safer spot and organized his remaining retainers into a battle formation. With a charge, the Turkish party was driven off, and the emperor was able to reunite with what remained of the rearguard. But it seems that part of what saved the emperor is that the Turks discovered a part of the baggage train previously untouched. Manuel Komnenos was forced to watch as the Turks plundered the supplies of the army and ripped apart bags overflowing with gold coins. As the Turks sacked the baggage train and began assembling ominously nearby, and what remained of the army consolidated around the emperor, the exhausted and parched Manuel Komnenos called for water. But upon inspecting it, the emperor saw that it was flecked with human gore. Horrified, the emperor threw the water down and wailed that he had almost drunk the blood of Christians, something he had never imagined before, to which, ominously, a nearby common soldier reportedly responded in fury, "Get along with you, O Emperor. This is certainly not so. Oh no, this is not the first time. Often in the past you have drunk unto intoxication from a wholly unmixed wine bowl of Christian blood, stripping and gleaning your subjects." It seems that, at this point, Manuel Komnenos totally shut down. He sat down and could not even rouse himself. He remained silent, whatever abuse was hurled at him by his men, and whatever news came to him of the Turks assembling around him and looting the baggage. Like a broken gambler who has lost it all, he buried his head in his hands and remained motionless, lost in his thoughts and his misery. As the sun began to sink, The final survivors straggled into the imperial camp, and when night finally fell, the fighting ceased. Over the night, Manuel Komnenos urgently conferred with his advisors. With the innumerable campfires of the Turkish army blazing around them on all sides, it was apparent that, in the morning, the Turks would be able to ride in and destroy them if they so chose. However, in the Turkish camp, the limping lion also sat in conference with his advisors. We can't be sure why, but it is apparent that Kılıç Arslan ultimately decided against destroying Manuel Komnenos and his army. Remember, the Sultan had not initially even wanted to fight this battle. He had been negotiating with the emperor up until the eve of the fighting. Maybe Kılıç Arslan feared the chaos that would erupt in Constantinople if the emperor was killed. Maybe he had some personal feelings of friendship with the emperor left over from his visit to the imperial capital. Maybe he feared the consequences for his own rule at home, that is, his own legitimacy among his overwhelmingly Christian subjects if he killed the emperor of the Romans. We just can't know why, but whatever the reasons, the limping lion decided to impose a peace on the emperor instead of finishing him off. Thus, when the sun rose on the next day, the 18th of September, 1176, as the Turks rode around the encircled Byzantine army, the limping lion dispatched to the surrounded imperial camp his grand vizier, Ikhtiar al-Din Gavras. Gavras brought with him a rare Nicaean horse as a gift for the Emperor of the Romans, a breed of horse from Iran that had been greatly prized ever since the days of Herodotus, and which would be extinct within a century. The horse was adorned with a silver-mounted bridle, and Gavras carried a great double-edged sword as a further gift to the emperor. Upon entering the imperial presence, Gavras prostrated himself in the Perso-Islamic fashion. He then rose and greeted the emperor in Greek. Niketas Choniates records an interesting anecdote of this meeting between Gavras and Manuel Komnenos, writing that Gavras observed the yellowish appearance of the surcoat over the emperor's coat of mail and remarked, "This is not an auspicious color, O emperor, but in the hour of warfare it very much militates against good fortune." Manuel, forcing a brief smile at these words, removed the surcoat embroidered with purple and gold and presented it to Gavras. And I'd like to just pause and take a look at this scene. The Turkish Grand Vizier, a Greek Muslim, descended from an ancient and venerable Byzantine noble family, dressed in Persian-style robes and prostrating himself in the classic Perso-Islamic style before the Roman emperor, presenting to him the terms of the Turkish Roman Sultan in the Greek language, bearing with him a gift of an Iranian breed of horse, and being gifted the purple and gold coat of the Emperor of the Romans. To me, this scene, more than any other we've covered so far, really embodies the fluid nature of Anatolia at this time. A world of shifting and overlapping religions and cultures and identities. A place of grays, not a world of black and white. The terms Gavras presented to the emperor were, on some level, humiliating, but also not particularly harsh. It went without saying that all of the onerous obligations that the Sultan had agreed to when he was a supplicant in Constantinople just over a decade ago were shredded. And further terms were imposed on the emperor. Terms designed to cement Turkish control over Anatolia. The recently rebuilt fortifications at Dorylaeum and Sublaeum were to be destroyed and the garrisons removed. The two sides would exchange prisoners, following which Manuel was to withdraw his remaining army to the west and give up the campaign. and above all, the Sultanate's rule over the plateau was to be recognized, and the emperor would promise to refrain from ever again launching an attack against the Sultanate of Rum. In short, Turkish rule over Inner Anatolia was to be recognized and confirmed for all time. Though the terms were humiliating, Manuel Komnenos knew that he had no choice but to accept them. His army was almost entirely destroyed, and he was surrounded. If the limping lion wished to, he could order the destruction of the entire Roman army and the death of the emperor himself. And so the emperor of the Romans bowed to the inevitable and accepted the terms of the Roman Sultan. Good to his word, the limping lion pulled his armies back and allowed the Romans to march away from Myriokephalon to the west. Though exact numbers are hard to come by, most historians believe that well over half of the Roman soldiers taken east were now dead. As the Imperial Army dragged itself back to Honaz and the safety of the Meander Valley, they were of course pursued by the wild tribes, the uncontrollable Turkmen, who, in any event, the Sultan now had a little inclination to control. Further men and beasts fell in the grueling march home before finally the army passed firmly back into imperial territory. The Emperor of the Romans had set out to reverse the verdict of Manzikert, and had ended by totally confirming it. What can we say about the Battle of Myriokephalon? In some ways, the terms of the treaty would prove to be ephemeral. The Romans started tearing down the fortresses at Dorylaeum and Dorylaeum, but they dragged their feet, and the fortresses were only partially destroyed. Indeed, they would eventually be rebuilt. And the Romans would even occasionally defeat the Turks in western Anatolia over the coming years. Indeed, many people, both Greek and Turkish, then and now, have wondered why Kılıç Arslan II did not exploit his victory more. He certainly was in a position to do so, but seems to have stepped back from a greater escalation. Given this, some modern historians argue that the importance of Myriokephalon can be overblown. However, I think that this is missing the forest for the trees a little bit. Yes, in the immediate term, the exact terms of the treaty were not necessarily upheld. And yes, the Byzantine military retained the capability to fight the Turks in the fields and even, occasionally, to win. But never again would a large Roman army march onto the Anatolian plateau. Never again would a Byzantine army attempt to take Konya. The days of the Roman Empire contesting the rule of Inner Anatolia, which was once the heartland of the empire, of emperors dreaming of overthrowing the Sultanate and driving the Turks out of Anatolia, were now definitively over. For decades, really a century by this point, Byzantium had been living with a fantasy that Turkish rule in Anatolia was ephemeral, and like the Pechenegs and the Kipchaks and the Bulgars before them, the rule of these steppe barbarians would end, and the lands they ruled would be returned to the empire. Indeed, Constantinople was still working under the legal fiction that the empire had not technically surrendered its claim to Anatolia, but merely delegated its rule to the sultans of Rum and the other beys. These legal fictions and delusions, embodied by the occasionally delusional Manuel Komnenos, were now shattered. The Turks were here to stay, and Turkish rule of the Anatolian plateau, rule that has continued down to this very day, was confirmed. It was now inevitable that a permanent and independent Turkish state would endure in Anatolia. If Manzikert was the battle in which the gates of Anatolia were opened to the Turks, Myriokephalon, was the battle in which their deed to the house was conveyed. During the Turkish War of Independence, when Greek armies again invaded Anatolia 700 years after Myriokephalon, Atatürk famously referred to Anatolia as the final refuge of the Turkish nation. Anadolu, Türk milletinin son sığınağıdır. To the father of the Turks, Anatolia was the hearth, the inner sanctum of the Turkish nation. And in some ways it was here, at Myriokephalon, that this hearth was lit, that this inner sanctum was consecrated. So next time, with the hearth of Anatolia now lit, we will pick back up with the story of the Sultanate of Rum, as Kılıç Arslan rides forth to cement the rule of the Roman Sultan over Anatolia. But we will also see the aging Sultan worry about the succession to his rule, and we will see yet another Sultan march out, a Sultan on the road towards Jerusalem. And this will ultimately lead to another great army being raised in the West, an army that will, soon enough, march into the inner sanctum of Turkish Anatolia.